So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session 4 of the Cybercrime track. Let me start this session by introducing today's panel. Actually, the first panelist is Mr. Alan Kohn. Maybe I think you can, introduce yourself a little bit. Yeah, because I think you were not in the panel yesterday.
So
yes,
thank you. So I'm Alan Kohn. I am counsel with the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson, and a lawyer and consultant on security and technology issues. I was until April the Assistant Secretary for Strategy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Then, as you know, Angela McKay, I think the session 2 moderator from Microsoft, and also colleagues to my left, David Berg from PwC at the session 3 moderators. I hope that you did enjoy last night and then you feel refreshed a little bit to make an additional contribution, I hope. So this 90-minute summary session is designed to prepare concrete items to be presented at plenary session. So in terms of the cybercrime track. So the item we will present should include possible way forward, not just the problems or the issues. So way forward to better address cybercrime nationally and internationally based on the outcomes of our discussion yesterday, as well as this session. So I'd like you to be innovative today as well, actually for the audience as well. In terms of the handout, I guess all of us are given the, I think that's the track summary, including audience. Do you? Okay, I think that's all of us are given this track summary. So I think that's as long as you were in the morning session, using Kaspersky's session, I think you have found it. So if you do not have it, please get it. I think it covers the main points. So I do not intend to duplicate all of them. So actually, how we are going to structure this session is that actually each session chair or moderator is going to provide you summary, very short summary, and then Alan, that you are going to actually share your views on all of the cybercrime session. So actually, you are going to provide kind of third person's assessment on what we did. So actually, let me start by saying that if you take a look at the track C summary, you can find 4 main points. So one is a need for international framework to address cybercrime. Second is a challenge in aligning policy and the legal frameworks with the pace of technological innovation. Third is building coordinated public-private partnership and information sharing. Fourth, emerging security and the privacy challenges. Actually, these 4 points will be touched upon by each moderators, including myself. I would like to briefly summarize what we discussed in the session 1, which is a global law enforcement effort to tackle the cybercrime. I think that's we discussed the legislative framework. We need a clear legislative framework globally. Then we touch upon the Cybercrime Convention that Alexander Seger presented, what is working, what is not working, what's need to be done. So I think that's the beyond Cybercrime Convention. We need something more to address the new way of actually to address technological advancement from the criminal procedures perspective, especially the access to the cloud data, etc. That is something not creating brand new treaty. It's kind of an amendment to the existing the mechanism of information sharing and then the harmonization of the national legislation. We mentioned it. Also, we discussed some sort of the distinctions between the national security and also criminal justice. Although the cyber espionage or industrial espionage can be penalized in almost all nations, but I think that can be solved not through I'd say, nation states judicial system, but more or less the diplomacy. So I think that's the criminal justice system, international level. Perhaps I think cyber espionage is not a good topic to discuss. Maybe I think that we just focus on purely the criminal aspect of what is going on in the cyberspace. In terms of national perspective, it was clearly mentioned by all four speakers, panelists. There is a need to collaborate more with non-state actors. I'm talking about good non-state actors like Google and international partners, such as through the information sharing and also the joint investigation. So in terms of the information sharing, which we will revisit later on this session. Oh, by the way, this session fast, actually the 30 minutes would be wrap up, and the next 30 minutes would be actually the discussion amongst the panelists, and the last 30 minutes would be entire discussion involving the panelists. So I think that the information sharing part of it would be the key actually issues to be further discussed among us. Then we also mentioned that technological advancement is always ahead of the laws and the regulations. We need to catch up, but this is easy to say and difficult to do. One of the colleagues from the floor mentioned how can developed countries support developing countries. I think that this aspect, capacity building, is very important. I think that's Alexander Seger mentioned, actually the Budapest, in the context of the Budapest Convention, the actually Council of Europe and other international partners assisted or continue to assist developing countries. But I think that's that we are only as strong as our weakest link. Especially the cybercrime is transnational crime in nature. I think that's the only like-minded country approach does have limited impact on the entire cybercrime issue. So we need to involve actually the countries who are not present here, perhaps in the China, Brazil, Russia, those are actually the emerging powers. So I think that aspect was actually mentioned during the session and actually outside the session. That is something we need to consider when it comes to the conclusion and the way forward of the cybercrime track session. Maybe I think I need to stop here, and then I'd like to turn the floor to Angela. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So I had the privilege of moderating the second track, our second session within the cybercrime track, and it was focused on industry efforts. We broke the conversation into three main sections: securing systems today, collaboration, and what to be done about some of the future innovations that are going to be coming. The panelists consisted of three very strong and passionate technologists. I'd like to go ahead and thank them again for being very interactive with each other. It made for a lively discussion. And each of them talked a little bit about technology innovations, operational approaches to improve and counter cybercrime, and kind of policy and strategy. In securing systems today, we had a couple of things. We talked basically about how cybercrime will continue to grow despite increased attention and investment, and that still much needs to be done around the basics. And these ultimately, many of the conversation points here were upstream of cybercrime, and we're really looking at some of the things that need to be done to improve security, regardless of who the actor type is. Some of the things that were mentioned in the basics category was, for example, asset identification and management. One of the examples highlighted was that when the Heartbleed open source vulnerability came out, most people did not actually know the websites they were managing, how to scan for that particular vulnerability and update it. And the ecosystem took quite a period of time, and in some cases is still dealing with updating against that vulnerability. Data classification and knowing kind of what's important to you was also talked about. And then there was some mention of more advanced techniques to improve cybersecurity, things like data deaggregation, so actually separating out data pools. One of our panelists highlighted how Switzerland is doing that with some of their electronic voting. There was also discussion of architecting communities based on common risk models. So you would almost have a rule set to operate within a particular community. And then last thing that I thought was very relevant was the need to recognize that at some point in time, all companies are going to be building and creating software. And so that creates this opportunity to start thinking like a platform. And the example here is Uber. Well, I know Uber does not operate in Japan. Most people are familiar with its business model. And it really just connects and provides a platform to connect people and cars with people who want rides. I'm a strong user of that particular service. I like it a lot. But then they're going to be able to do other things like grocery delivery. So it's thinking like a platform. We also highlighted the importance of C-suite attention and engagement and how that is growing. I was asked to mention this in the summary session yesterday. But also that these folks are kind of struggling to take on and understand their responsibilities in this space to include cyber risk as part of enterprise risk management. We talked about the need to grow a workforce, not only for industry, but also for governments, and that events like this are one of the ways to help raise awareness around these issues, but that also, and I think this was something I added, that we need to think about how technology can be used, things like cloud computing where you can start to scale the impact of the limited security expertise that exists in the world. Final point in this is we talked about how the policy environment really is very active in this space, both on cybercrime and things like critical infrastructure protection and information sharing, but that it struggles to keep up with the pace of innovation. And that in some ways, the business world is more agile. In collaboration, we talked a little bit, I would summarize that it's basically evolving and improving, but more needs to be done. The group did say kind of information sharing is a tool, not an outcome, and that technological innovation, like the richness of the device world that's going to be coming with IoT and smart devices, will require people to think about how to enable interoperability between data sets to take advantage of both how to improve security, but also how to counter cybercrime, that you're going to need to be able to bring data sets together in order to analyze them properly. We did talk about how kind of things like the botnet takedowns, Simba was one of the examples mentioned, are good and should continue. But again, that upstream collaboration on things like standards. What are the common standards to help improve security? And maturity models that are driven by a collective point of view across multiple industry players could be really helpful. Again, the point on public-private partnerships are important was brought up, but that they should really focus on outcomes and goals versus controls, because again, kind of that pace of innovation is in advance. One of the questions I thought that was really interesting that came up was around collaboration with security researchers and exploring how to promote an environment of incentives, such as bug bounties, and how research may be disincentivized through things like export controls. And I think that's probably something we need to pick up and talk about a little bit more, the incentives and disincentives, whether it's through regulatory models or voluntary frameworks. I'll conclude, as our group did, on what's kind of coming over the horizon in the future. First of all, people talked a lot about different technologies, whether IoT, automation, blockchains. But the fundamental that I really heard across the group was a couple of things. One, it's critical to learn and scale the practices we've seen in IoT and operational technology the IT wave and the OT or operational technology wave into IoT. Those practices include, again, some of the basics like security by design, but also as you start to have this device-rich environment, efforts to improve identity management and authentication. I thought one of the really interesting examples that was brought up was how devices will be able to think a little bit like cells in the body and have artificial intelligence and be able to communicate, hey, I'm under attack and this is what happened to me and how I was able to recover from it. Or, hey, I am under attack and it seems like I'm going down, but don't let this process run because it could hurt you as well. I think that models, and this was not brought up, but I think models like that help non-technologists understand technology are increasingly important. And then last point is that it sounds like as we start to have continue to have actually a more egalitarian innovation wave, that market competition will help to drive security improvements, but that there's not yet a lot of tolerance, particularly in the consumer side, but in general, for increased cost for security. It sounds like there will also potentially be a role for reputational risk and liability sometime in the future, particularly for higher risk products and services. That was about it.
Thank you. So David?
So in the third session, we had, I think, a very good conversation, and it unfolded in summary as follows. I started off and talked about how in my personal experience as a incident and breach responder, I've seen tremendous changes occur really over the last 14 years, and saw different examples of law enforcement and other flavors of information sharing take place during that time. And so the arc of that story started with a $200 ransom demand back in 2000 to 2007 to a $10 million ATM cash out transaction undertaken by organized crime group in Eastern Europe at a very, very sophisticated level of attack. We saw extraordinary exchange of information between the victim organization and the FBI, as well as going all the way to prosecuting the attackers who lived in Eastern Europe. And then we moved on to 2014. We saw a very sophisticated nation-state attack going. Really, it was targeted for the sake of espionage. And in this example, in 2014, we saw an even more sophisticated level of interaction and involvement of law enforcement that went way beyond purely sharing information to a point where we had law enforcement involvement, really law enforcement functioning almost as a consultant on site, on scene, sharing threat information with the victim organization, and also using some very advanced technologies that could be deployed in the enterprise to disrupt threat actors. So in a short period of time, massive change, both in terms of the level of sophistication of the attacker, as well as the capabilities and examples of interaction from an information sharing perspective. I went on then to talk about, and I'm going to do it again here with my prop, that at PwC we've been working this is in your information packet. Encourage you to take a look at it. We've been working very hard with the administration in the United States to follow up on the announcement that came out in March of 2015 around the formation of information sharing and analysis organizations in the United States, or ISAOs. So a lot of the conversation, all three of the sessions talked about information sharing. We've done a lot of work working with the White House, surveying many companies, think tanks, academicians, to really start to think about how do we share information, threat information, among the public and private sector. And I talked about a meeting that was held earlier last week, was a follow-up meeting where we had, once again, Michael Daniel, who's the special advisor to President Obama around cyber, who talked about the current status of where legislation sits in the United States, as well as advancements in helping to mature these ISAOs in the U.S. And we talked specifically about the fact that one of the component parts of our meeting on Tuesday involved international information sharing and how multinational corporations that may operate around the world, what the models might look like to be able to share information both among ISAOs as well as between ISAOs. We talked a little bit about the interaction, or the differences rather, between ISACs and ISAOs, and the fact that ISAOs really are designed to be able to fill white space that the ISACs that are largely found in the United States, but also have some international implications, that the ISAOs really can help us fill the gaps. We had a distinguished panel, just like all of the other sessions. We started off with Sherry McGuire from Symantec, and I think one of the key points that she made is that Symantec is part of something called the Cyber Threat Alliance, along with Microsoft, McAfee, Fortinet, and Palo Alto Networks. And I think this was a really interesting evolution in the security industry, where you have some of the largest security brands in the world sharing openly threat intelligence information with one another, which I think we didn't have time to talk about it. Maybe this is something we'll have time to talk about today, but I think that model has profound implication to the security industry. You really, what's happening is some of the value, the key differentiators for security industries are destroyed by virtue of the fact that they're working together to share threat information with one another. And I think that what you have is the potential to get to, really a cyber immune system where individual cells very quickly start communicating with other cells that, we have an infection, we have a problem. And I think, again, the work of Microsoft and the other security companies and technology companies that created the Cyber Threat Alliance, I think, are doing very important work. We had Toshi Nawasan, who's one of the leading cybersecurity experts in Japan, talked about some of his real-world experience, and really he focused on some of the challenges that occur inside an enterprise, inside an organization, when a breach occurs, just how hard it is to coordinate and really think clearly among various functional areas when a breach is occurring, and that there's a flood of information that will come in that has to be very quickly analyzed, understood, and decided, and then acted upon. And so that led to some conversation about the importance of preparing in advance of a cyber attack, and really, working with executives to think through roles and responsibilities, and how, when the breach occurs, and this wasn't said yesterday, I think we all recognize right now, there is no more if. It's no more if. This is just a business process that you have to be prepared to run. We then went on and we heard from the Honorable Judge Stein Schloberg, who's sitting over there, who talked about his experience and observations around leveraging international law enforcement mechanisms, as well as international courts, to be able to prosecute cybercrime. He also talked about and advocated the use of more of a model that would be centered on how the United Nations operates. And he was very optimistic on being able to leverage the UN or a UN-type body to help us fight cybercrime, but also to potentially advocate or facilitate information sharing. And then we heard from Michael Jackson, who was the former deputy director of the Department of Homeland Security, who worked very closely with Secretary Chertoff, who we all heard yesterday morning, along with Rod Beckstrom. And Michael Jackson made a number of points based on his experience helping the Department of Homeland Security get stood up and evolve after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. But he made a couple of, I think, really important points. One of them was, he said, in the conversation here, we can't lose sight of the fact that mid-sized and small companies have challenges and needs too. And I do think that's a very important point. Hopefully we can emphasize this as we talk today. We are talking about a highly interconnected business ecosystem where businesses, large, mid-size and small, are all interconnected with one another. And he kept making the point about we are really only as strong as our weakest link, which I think is an important point. He went on to, towards the end of his comments, talked about the fact that he saw promise in the use of cloud being a facilitator for information sharing among many organizations all around the world. I think that may be an important point. Rod Beckstrom also made that point about the use of cloud as a potential solution to cybercrime. And Angela, I think, mentioned that as well. And then we had some good questions from the audience. There were 3 questions that come to mind that I think were interesting. One of them was a question about whether or not the country of Japan, should create an MI6 or a CIA-type organization to help itself combat cybercrime. There was a question about where do you draw the line between being the victim of a crime, even if it's an advanced threat actor, and who has responsibility for potentially going on the offensive, performing offensive attacks, and really how do you delineate roles and responsibilities when it comes to potentially hacking back. And then there was, I think, a very interesting question about in the context of an information sharing mechanism, we can't lose sight of the fact that there are human beings that are involved in the process, vetting information, making decisions about sharing information, maybe making decisions about the quality of information, enriching information. And the question was, in a system where we are looking to try to share threat information with one another, how do we know that the individuals that are operating the system are trustworthy themselves? And so that raised some conversation about insider threat, insider risk. I was a little surprised we didn't hear about insider as one of the topics in the Kaspersky discussion a few minutes ago, but nonetheless, that was one of the topics of discussion that the audience asked us about. And that's my summary.
Thank you. So maybe Alan, I think that's after listening to the summaries of the 3 sessions. So how do you think about this one?
So I had the privilege of listening to yesterday's panels without having the obligation to comment, which was useful. I enjoyed the panels, and my co-panelists this morning did an excellent job of moving us through a number of topics. So what I did was just try to step back and think about what did we hear in total, and where might that point us in terms of areas to look at for actions to take. And there's 4 areas that I saw that I thought would be worth just walking through. First is related to the nature of the threat, and really making sure we define and understand why does cooperation across the public and private sectors help us address cybercrime specifically. We know in the context of cybersecurity, what about cybercrime? Second, the question of trust, which is inescapable, and the need, in a sense, to get into a post-trust environment and to recognize that shortcomings in trust are going to exist. Third is the question of information sharing, which I think we'll discuss more extensively, and the fourth is the rule of law. So first, with respect to the nature of the threat, I mean, we know cybercrime is a big problem, even if we can't quantify it. And we know that the lines between cyber espionage, hacktivism, and cybercrime can blur. But in focusing specifically on cybercrime, a couple of interesting things that Angela listed out, a whole list of things that industry can do. And she touched on it this morning also, but things like product assurance, identity management and authentication, architecture changes for security, collaboration with security researchers. Think about the things that this does to reduce the opportunities for cybercrime and to raise the bar for successful criminal activity. And in addition, things that industry can do like preserving traffic logs, and other activities that can actually help enable successful criminal investigations and prosecutions. And so what does that mean that we might want to think about? I think Jerry Hoff pointed out, again, that there's this question of does everyone, public and private, understand what truly is at risk. Because if we understand it and have a shared understanding, we can begin to think about, well, how can government provide perhaps more threat intelligence about the things that are truly at risk? And how can information from the private sector help government prioritize and make decisions about where impacts can be greatest? And second, I think Sherry Maguire pointed out, and we've talked about this morning, can law enforcement best understand and harness technology for both prevention and investigation? And in one aspect, can things like artificial intelligence or machine learning substitute to the degree deemed acceptable for some of the workforce shortages and some of the trust issues? So moving to that, to the questions of trust and a post-trust environment, it's inescapable that we have to deal with the trust issue. It was interesting, Rod Beckstrom in the plenary yesterday morning talked about how in cyberspace sovereignty and borders don't exist. Well, the one place they exist is here in the discussion of cybercrime, which is rooted in national standards, national laws, and doesn't mimic the global and borderless nature of the internet. And so we can't escape the challenge of trust. But in a sense, we need to move past that. We can't let trust, the challenges of trust, stop us from engaging in beneficial activities. It was interesting, we talked, there was discussion about the Five Eyes construct. General Flynn mentioned that this was a 20th century construct. I'd add that this is also an intelligence construct. This was a construct that was developed for the sharing of highly classified national security intelligence around which other things got built. And perhaps it's not the anchor around which things like cooperation on cybercrime are most effectively built. And I don't think there would be a lot of dispute around that. What it does illustrate is a real desire to construct and find trusted forums. And the Five Eyes Forum does represent that. But it doesn't need to be the only one. And Nakatani-san really pointed this out, the challenge of this, which is how do we establish trust without being there? You can't be dependent on just the human link. We cannot. The world is too big. The challenges are too vast. The number of organizations are too many. It's not possible. Carlos also raised the question of using security innovation to scale security. Angela mentioned that this morning as well, and the examples of the Internet of Things or security by design. And so those are areas where it might suggest thinking. Number one, can networks create trust? Can we lead with the network rather than the need to create trust and build trust through the network? And second, can we, in a sense, move to a post-trust environment? And if we think about things like smart devices or the blockchain and a distributed ledger system, these are post-trust innovations. This is a place where individuals place their trust in the process, not in any other person or an institution. Okay, so then third, information sharing. It was interesting, Michael Jackson on the panel yesterday said that, and repeated something that I think a lot of us know or we all come to accept, is that information sharing is at the core of public-private cooperation. But both Michael Jackson, Secretary Chertoff in the plenary yesterday, and the panelists and moderators all day highlighted that information sharing is a means. It's not an end. So what does that mean? So Glenn Lewis from the Australian Federal Police pointed out that, look, you can get to a point where you can become comfortable with sharing with many partners so long as source information or personally identifiable information is not part of the records. So how do we get to the structures, the processes, and the trust to make that work? Many speakers highlighted the challenge of overclassification, and I think that's very true. Classification exists, law enforcement controls on information exist, but that can't stand in the way of finding ways to collaborate and cooperate. Glenn also pointed out another important point, which is that the proliferation of structures is ultimately destructive, and that the key may be to network the existing structures and then to seek to fill the gaps. Angela, Sherry also highlighted the government as catalyst for private-private sharing. And it was interesting, Secretary Chertoff in the plenary yesterday noted that there's a tension between, right, that the government needs to be a participant, not a gatekeeper, in information sharing for cybersecurity. But does that change a little bit when we're talking about cybercrime, which is so rooted in the need for effective criminal investigation and prosecution? And the other point, maybe looking forward, is, again, can we use shared information not just to enable protective or investigative activities, but to drive innovation around those technologies that might help us move to that post-trust environment? And then finally, the question of rule of law. Fighting cybercrime, as opposed to the broader cybersecurity question, is just simply more dependent and more limited by national borders than cybersecurity. It is dependent on the structure and the rule of law in all the nations of the world. We know that international structures, we think of the MLAT process, are just not well suited for cyber, for speed, for volume. We talked about the Budapest Convention, which has a mini MLAT process in it, and its strengths and some of its limitations, as well as the limitations on the accepted countries' comforts in acceding to the convention itself, even if they're comfortable with the legal principles embodied therein. And that when we're talking about cybercrime in particular, informal cooperation can only take us so far because of the need to be able to use information and data in an evidentiary manner. Okay, so what does that mean? Another tension that was interesting, and there were some tensions that were pointed out, that national authorities in many instances are subsuming law enforcement authorities. And that can interfere with the ability to cooperate on cybercrime across borders. And particularly the paradigm of the war paradigm can exacerbate that challenge. Because sometimes it's easier to collaborate on law enforcement issues than it is on national security issues. It was interesting, there's also a tension in a certain way between the privacy and human rights protections and things like data localization and laws meant to enable cross-border collaboration on cybercrime. I did take a look at Twitter this morning, and George Schmidt, I don't know if he's in this session or not, made an interesting tweet, which is that in the US, we think that more data equals more security. Whereas in Europe, we think about more data protection, meaning less surface area for threat. And the conception will be different across different countries, different regions. So what does that mean to think about? Well, first, is there a maturity model for the development and strengthening of rule of law, especially in countries that have both not acceded to the Budapest Convention and don't have national laws that match its provisions? And then second, can the collaboration that's built, can the work done together on cybercrime form the foundation for approaching some of the increasingly difficult issues, things like encryption, data localization, data use? So those were the things that I heard as a observer to yesterday's sessions, and perhaps they help us think about what comes next.
Thank you, Alan. I would like to frame this coming 30 minutes discussion by first developing what you said first, actually the magnitude of cybercrime. I think, and then that is going to be leading the discussion on the information sharing. I think that throughout the 3 sessions yesterday, I feel that the much focus of discussion, our discussion, was on the models of the information sharing. So what kind of platform we need to have, etc. So what does it mean by the fighting cybercrime, especially from law enforcement perspective? Well, it's not only from the law enforcement perspective, from the public sector perspective. I would say that essentially, how can we better protect our citizens? That's it. And then the primary responsibility, I would say, goes to the law enforcement, because law enforcement has responsibility to ensure the citizens' safety and the security, regardless of the people who are on the street or online. So no problem, actually, in that matter. But I think the situation regarding cybercrime is different from when the people are on the street. What does it mean? The criminal use of the internet fundamentally challenges law enforcement traditional method of the detection and the investigation of crime and the criminals. So let me give you just one example. This is a food for thought. Actually, this is very interesting statistics. The bank robberies in the UK. According to the British Banking Association, the number of the bank robberies in 1992 in the
Can I
UK.
interrupt you? You should poll. I think you should ask the audience this one because it's so interesting. Sorry to interrupt you.
Huh?
I think you should ask instead of don't
Okay,
just
okay,
give,
okay, okay.
Don't just give them the numbers.
Maybe I think that's the. Thank you much. Good suggestion. So actually, to the audience, just a question. How many actually the bank robbery cases, including attempt in the UK, took place in 1992? 1992 bank robberies in the UK.
So physical bank
Physical
robberies.
bank
Physical
robberies.
bank
Physical.
robberies.
Actually, 1992, I think internet was in the quite a rudimentary stage. Paul, you shouldn't speak because you know the answer because you are from the UK. So, is there anybody who can guess how many bank robbery cases? Anyone? Maybe you can. How many cases? Yeah, please. 20. Bank robberies.
Physical bank
Physical,
robberies,
physical.
1992, UK.
Actually, bank robberies actually with guns and the face mask. 4 in the UK. 0. 1992.
1992.
You were there. Okay.
Challenging economic times.
Yes, yeah, challenging economic time, 1992. Margaret Thatcher, I guess. So I think that's the 0 and the 420. Okay, answer is 847. Yeah, 847 physical bank robberies, including attempts in the UK. This is one statistics. So of course, not four. Actually, there are a lot. Maybe I think countryside, etc. So, and of course, I think that's every time bank robbery took place, bank came to the police and they made a report. We have a problem. X amount of money was stolen, etc. So, what would happen after 20 years ago, 2011? So, how many cases of the bank robberies? Once again, it's a physical bank robberies in the UK.
Sean,
Just guess.
Guess, Sean.
Just guess. 100. So 847 to 100. That's your guess. Huh? It's very close. Actually, it's dropped only 66 cases. 60 cases. 1992, 847. 2011, 66 cases, including attempt. So during the same period, I would say, the amount of money stolen from the UK banks obviously increased. Why? You can guess. It's online bank fraud. But I think we do not have actually the clear, I would say, precise statistics of the online banking fraud because, I mean, the bank behavior has changed. Their behavior has changed. Every time bank fraud took place, they don't come to the police. We have a problem. No. So actually, in terms of statistics, it's very challenging to.
And if I could just interrupt and just add that in the law enforcement session yesterday, what we heard from a gentleman from Japan was that the financial crime rate has just skyrocketed, gone from a very low level to I think the number was 27 million in just a 4-year period, and that's what they were able to quantify. So, happening in the UK, happening in Japan, happening everywhere.
Yes, that's right. It's good to happen everywhere. So, Alan, would you like to say?
No, I was just going to say there's 3 things we know about 2011. And number 1, there was a lot more, right? Crime. Number 2, it was a lot more than 862 or 847 attempts and successful online banks. And number 3, we have no idea what the actual number is. We only know that it's big.
So I would say the cybercrime information intelligence and also the evidence often rests in the hands of the private sectors, not in the law enforcement. And then I hate to say, but I think that's the private sectors are reluctant, often reluctant to share the information in relation to the incident of a cyber incident. And then, as a result, law enforcement agency, I would say, do not have the comprehensive pictures of the cybercrime, landscape, resulting in the difficulties of the formulating effective strategy and also the efficient deployment of the limited resources because they don't know what is happening entirely. So it means that law enforcement needs information from private sector to fulfill their duties. Their duties is very simple, once again, to protect citizens. So what do you think about the current situation? It's very challenging for law enforcement to locate, identify the criminals.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that highlights half the problem, right? Because the other half of the problem is that industry, business, needs information from law enforcement to know what's truly at risk, what are the threats, how should we be protecting ourselves? And law enforcement wants that too, because there's no way that national law enforcement in any country could post a uniformed officer at every single potential area of fraud, could investigate every attempt at online banking. So there's a reciprocal need by law enforcement for information and by industry for information.
I might add to that point, it could be interesting for us to talk about why. Why is that information not shared? And I think, Alan, you're starting to get to some of the reciprocal side. There are a couple things. One, there are requirements in the physical world that are different in the cyber world. But two, I think if there are not requirements, what is the incentive for sharing if there might, and I'm not in the banking industry, but why are they not sharing is a good question. Do they feel like it's not going to be acted upon, the information might not be secured, it could create the banking system as being a new target, or to the point of, are we getting some value back out of the exchange?
Well, if I could just add, there's a couple other, I think, data points, and there's another dimension to this that was discussed briefly by Secretary Chertoff yesterday morning. But a couple of data points. One of them is that when you study and you analyze trust that's out there, and trust has been a theme that we've talked about in this panel, but I think trust is one of the universal themes of this entire C3 conference. But when we look at trust in our 2016 Global State of Information Security Survey, that's also in your package, by the way, what we found when we surveyed over 10,000 companies around the world was that 60% of the respondents said they felt comfortable sharing threat information with, call it peers or other corporate entities. In other words, they feel as though they participate in a system of trust, but only 60% of the respondents indicated they felt that way. And what's very interesting is that only 40% of the respondents said they'd feel comfortable sharing information with government entities. So there is and if you take that 40% and you flip it around, what we're saying is 60% of companies do not feel comfortable sharing information with law enforcement, which brings me to a second statistic. This one isn't as empirical as the first. But we have a gentleman on our team who's a partner who used to be the deputy director of the FBI named Sean Joyce. And earlier this week, again at this ISAO session that we held, he asked the audience, he said, look, he said, from my vantage point at the top of the U.S. Law enforcement apparatus, law enforcement intelligence apparatus, when you look at cybercrime and cyber attacks, what percentage of the information to solve the case do you think government has versus industry? And he polled the room. And what he said, and he said, listen, I've been on both sides. I can tell you that the law enforcement and government apparatus has only 20% of the picture. 80% of the picture sits in the hands of corporations. And you really need to put together both pieces, as we've seen many times in real-world examples, including in the case studies that I talked about. You take the 80 and the 20 and you get 100%. You get the picture. I mean, this is really, I think, one of the underlying reasons why information sharing is so important. And then there's one last layer to it, and this is what I think Secretary Chertoff alluded to during yesterday morning session. I think it's a very important one that we haven't really spent enough time talking about, but that is that various international law enforcement and intelligence agencies have good visibility into what the bad guys are doing. They understand planning, tools, techniques that are resident on various command and control nodes, or even botnets that are being used to commit cyber attacks. They penetrate those nodes because they can. They penetrate those nodes to capture intelligence about what the bad guys are thinking and doing. And there's a very interesting question about at what point do you expose that information to really protect victims. There's ample evidence of many situations where law enforcement or intelligence agencies are watching an attack take place because they want to learn. And I think one of the questions around information sharing is how much do you pull back that curtain? How much of that information be exposed, maybe more quickly, to help a victim earlier on in the life cycle, or to reduce the period in time before detection actually occurs?
And that's the challenge, and it's an interesting question, because if you think about the last statistic, that the 80% of the information about the threat picture is resident out in the private sector. It's resident in a bunch of different places, and as you aggregate it together, you get to that 80% from looking at what the different companies have and what they see. That 20% that government has tends to be more unique. And it is, I think, in many ways, the piece that the private sector wants. And if we think about going to Angela's last point about incentives, in a sense, the best incentive for a company to share or a government to share is that you're getting something useful for what you are doing. And if you think about in your own experience, that's the thing that incentivizes you the most to do something, is if you get something useful in return. We work with public policy levers for incentives as a substitute for that in many ways. But
in terms of the incentive to share information, I think that's that is very simple. I think that's the best one, is that to actually protect yourself. And then that is why I think that what kind of information should be shared with whom, perhaps, and how, that is very important. Huh?
I was going to say, I think we actually need to start also decomposing the types of information, because what can be shared voluntarily versus what cannot be shared voluntarily from the private sector point of view is very important. What we can share, consistent with most legal regimes, is oftentimes technical information on the types of attacks we're seeing. They are indicators of compromise. They are things like malware signatures, IP addresses, not in Europe, of botnet command and control locations. But we cannot share the kind of content information that oftentimes is what law enforcement needs to effectively investigate and prosecute. That's the piece where, from a private sector point of view, we need a legal request based on rule of law to actually go further into the information that actually helps with the prosecution. And so in addition to the incentive and disincentive, I think we have to think, what are the types of information that can be shared under which legal paradigm, voluntarily or as requested by law enforcement?
I think I fully actually in agreement with what you said. Actually, I drafted some I would say slides in terms of the visualization of what we discussed yesterday. Look at this one. So actually, the information we can share depends on what kind of information we want to have from whom. So it's kind of the visualization. Actually, for instance, information sharing within the government, law enforcement to law enforcement, or law enforcement regulatory. And then in terms of the private sector, the same financial sector, we have the ISAC, which was mentioned yesterday. The same sector information sharing. It's more like protecting themselves. But also the cross-sector issues, because I think that's the targeting, actually the cyber criminals, they are looking at not only one specific sector, but also the other sector as well. And also the government and the private sector information sharing. I think the information sharing is just like a matrix. And then actually the Angela mentioned very important things, that what information can be shared by the actually private companies. One of the, I would say, good example was actually the SIMDA botnet, which was mentioned yesterday in the panel 1, 2, 3, almost all of them. But I just would like to share a little bit details about botnet takedown, the SIMDA botnet, because I think that many times mentioned, but I think that nobody knows, actually what it means, the SIMDA botnet. So actually, to tackle the botnet, which is quite a problematic infrastructure on the cyberspace, Interpol IGCA in Singapore actually coordinated operation targeting SIMDA botnet, which infected about 770,000 computers and servers, more than 190 member and more than 190 countries. Actually, the joint task force was mounted this year by law enforcement of the United States, Netherlands, Poland, Luxembourg, and Russia, so resulting in the taking down of the CC server, command and control servers, of the SIMDA botnet in 5 countries I mentioned. Once again, 5 countries, especially look at 2 countries, Russia, United States. It's a joint operation. Joint operation. I would say that if the US and Russia talk to each other, but given the current political situation, perhaps it wouldn't have happened without Interpol actually the facilitation. So I think that's what is needed in this specific context is actually digital forensic information and provided by actually the Microsoft. So what is important in this takedown is, one is law enforcement collaboration, regardless of the political situation. Number 2 is that the public-private partnership. So actually law enforcement does not have the heat map of the botnet CC server. We don't have it. Microsoft have it, so Microsoft gave us that information as a result of the mutual discussion. So we targeted. Actually, you have more than actually SIMDA botnet. I don't know how many or how much information you have, but law enforcement also has limited resources, so we targeted. I think that the Europol had the similar, actually the botnet takedown more or less the same timing, actually this April. And then based on the forensic information provided to Microsoft, Interpol IGC asked private sector experts who are now working at Interpol, side by side with Interpol staff, that is Kaspersky Lab, Transmicro, and the Japan Cyber Defense Institute. Their experts are physically embedded in the IGCI. So I think that they further developed information provided by Microsoft, and then based on the result of those kind of private expert-led so-called investigation, and Interpol facilitated the actually several member countries, including the country who are not participating in the takedown because of legislative issues, which already we discussed. So I think that's what law enforcement need in actually destroying the criminal infrastructure in cyberspace, thus protecting the citizens, is pretty much now simple. The information that are not in the hands of the law enforcement. We are not asking content all the time. Sometimes I think that law enforcement ask. But I think this is just one example how we are going to work together. And then actually based on, let's say, best practice, we can actually institutionalize the one success into more systematic success. So this is just an example for further discussion. And then, what do you think? This one? David?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that you're at a cyber conference when a slide is put up on the screen and it sounds like paparazzi in the room, all of the photographs being taken. So that was impressive. It's a very good slide. I actually was, as you were talking, I was thinking more about the solution and the solutions to this problem, because I think that we really do need to solve this problem. And when you have a convergence of things like the Cyber Threat Alliance, where you have extraordinary volumes of threat information. That's a good thing. Now, the negative part is volumes. And volumes is a very important part of the cyber crime story that we have to talk about, because what's happening is more and more information is in fact being both generated but also is able to be analyzed in connection with cases. And it can create a problem, but I think this is where technology is going to wind up being very, very useful. And I think just to make this real for a moment, you know, a few years ago, we did a very large breach response case, and we collected 500 billion evidence artifacts. 500 billion evidence artifacts. And so the only way to be able to figure out what happened is to be able to, you know, query the heck out of that 500 billion evidence artifacts. That actually creates some significant technical hurdles. These are technical hurdles that many of the security appliances today really struggle to be able to handle. Most of the SIM technologies choke when it comes to large volumes, and that's just a reality. And what we did is we took that 500 billion evidence artifacts and we threw it into a Hadoop cluster, and we were able to analyze it. Unfortunately, the queries, they took about 19 hours to run. So it was a very slow process to slog our way through the case to try to figure out what the heck happened. What's very interesting to me now is that when we take that same volume of information, 500 billion evidence artifacts, and that is retrospective, but nonetheless, put it up in a powerful cloud-based computing environment, now all of a sudden we can run those queries in 19 seconds. So you go from 19 hours to 19 seconds, and that's very important because, again, I think the volumes are only going to continue to increase. When you have things like the Cyber Threat Alliance that you can then combine with massive repositories of information from either, again, looking back or the operation of security products, security appliances, and other kinds of residue that comes from operating applications and technology, now all of a sudden we have an ability to really connect these two things and be able to gain insights very, very quickly. This has never before in the history of humanity been possible, but it is today. When the kinds of technologies that Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, et cetera, are able to run at massive scale, enabling extraordinary response times across massive amounts of information, amazing things are possible. I don't believe that we have reached an age where from a cybersecurity perspective, we've applied these technologies in a mature way, but this is going to happen. So I actually am very optimistic that we'll see more and more architectures like this that are going to bring together more and more information into a place where you have both government and private sector collaboration. Again, things like the Cyber Threat Alliance on the private sector side are very, very important. Virus total, very, very important. Massive repositories of information. So again, the combination of the accumulation of the information that we have, and also I think there's an enrichment that needs to happen as well, because knowing that you've got a piece of malware somewhere is the beginning of the process to crush the problem. But I think that this information sharing platforms set the stage in combination with the use of, and I would strongly advocate the use of extremely high performance, low cost cloud computing, can create very real and significant avenues that I think societally we can leverage to combat this very, very hard problem.
And Alan, did you want to say anything on that?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the other thing that bleeds into that is this idea of being able to automate series of actions based on information at scale. And we're focused, because we're in the cybercrime track, on the reactive and responsive side. But I also want to highlight the sharing benefits that occur on the proactive side, particularly when you start to be able to aggregate technical information and be able to say, identify patterns that individual data sets may not see, and say, we're starting to see a pattern of attack in, let's say, the financial services industry, and you can communicate that across geographic boundaries. So oftentimes the tools, techniques, and practices that are used in various sectors are similar. And so you can say, hey, maybe there are 2 banks in the US and 2 in China and 3 in the UK that happen to see the same thing, if you don't share and aggregate that, they may not say, hold on, there's actually a trend that's occurring in the banking industry. We can now send that information out to those who are not already in the data set so they can proactively prevent that attack from taking over their environment. And then at the same time, potentially use the aggregated information to respond to from a criminal perspective and deter and prosecute on the reactive side for those who've been already affected. And so that's one of those other things that I think is just really important.
One thing I do think that's important to look at with the slide, though, I think this discussion highlights that this is technically possible to do. But I think we also have to remember that there are human beings and organizations that need to make this work, and hurdles that presents. And just one to point out, the interest in the upper right-hand box on law enforcement sharing with regulators. We've wrestled with this challenge in the United States, where federal law enforcement has basically come to the perspective that corporate targets of breaches are victims, and they need to be addressed as victims, work through the process. The regulatory agencies see corporate breach targets in many instances as wrongdoers. Yes, and so we have to remember, again, going back to that question of what is the goal of why we're sharing, what are we trying to accomplish, and how do we best do that?
But can I just add one other quick point to pick up on what Angela said? I think we didn't really talk about this yesterday, but I do think there are very important advancements that are taking place in terms of attribution. But what we do not have in terms of attribution is a common taxonomy. And I think that it will be important, and what I mean is, many different security companies are going to name the same exact threat actor something else. And the government agencies are going to name that very same threat actor something else. So absent a common taxonomy, we're at a disadvantage to be able to take advantage of the threat information that's out there. I think that is a foundational element that will need to be quickly resolved. You need a periodic table of the threat actor that everyone uses. I do think, though, that Angela, you're also right about campaigns. And one of the really important insights that can come from threat information sharing is you can see a bigger pattern of activity, which is very important because we're not really talking about just identifying someone who's a victim, but we're identifying, you must anticipate that because this campaign is hitting this sector or this geography or a combination thereof, you need to be on a higher state of alert, or you need to do port blocking, whatever the technical remediation step may be. But that's the power systemically. That's one of an evidence of the power systemically of information sharing is protecting far larger than just the individual unit. It's really seeing how we all fit together in a connected way. And again, I think because of the advances that are taking place around attribution, because of the advances that are taking place in terms of actually threat and information sharing, because of the advances that are taking place in terms of low-cost, extremely high-performance technology, this problem, and I think, Alan, you're right, it's not going to be easy. There are these other, institutional governance elements and human elements that have to be resolved. But I actually am optimistic that we will see over the next 5 years extraordinary advances to combat this problem. It will not be eradicated. There's no way on earth that it will. But I think societally we are on the verge, and maybe this will be driven by industry, and I actually think it will. I think it's going to be solved more by free enterprise than it will be by government mandates. It will be, in other words, it's going to be solved by opt-in as opposed to force-in. But I do think we're on the, I think we can, and I think that's one of the importances of a gathering like this, is to openly talk about what's working and what the solutions may be to combat this very, very difficult and hard problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. I think that we should be optimistic.
Yeah.
And I think that we should be proud of what we have done. But I think, of course, I think the criminals are sometimes advancing ahead of us. So actually, we have the 21 minutes remaining, and then I think we need to discuss the way forward a little bit, and then open the floor. So I would say the information sharing platform should build in the scalability and the interoperabilities, having in mind the human factors, the new technology, etc. But I think that's the geographically speaking, of course, I think it needs to be scalable. That's my point. And then here's another one. So I just, once again, illustrated, visualized what we discussed yesterday, trusted plus home. What does this mean by trusted plus home? It's a neutral, secure, permanent. And then actually, the one of the panelists yesterday mentioned that rather than creating new center with a new mechanism, existing structure need to be better integrated. So I understand it from the viewpoint of the integration and the scalability in terms of information sharing platform. So how can you see it? Actually, it's a national level initiative and then government-led initiatives. It's a matrix way of understanding of the information sharing platform. I think this is kind of one of the springboard for discussion about the mechanism which we want to institutionalize somehow, and then this is already done. So for instance, at the global level and then multi-stakeholder, actually global level government is 5 eyes. It's a 5 eyes, which was mentioned out of data. But still, I think the 5 eyes is a global, actually globally working, but I think led by government. And then MSDCC is a Microsoft Digital Crime Center or the Cybercrime Center. This is actually the private sector initiative, but I think that it's a multi-stakeholder approach. And then it covers around the world. And then also IGCI, it's an international organization, and we engaged multi-stakeholders, not only law enforcement, but also academia and the public sectors. So actually, depending on the needs, whether depending on the magnitude of the threat, we can differentiate the national initiative, regional, and the global. So it's not right or wrong, it's just a matter of necessity, and depending on the priorities of the organization which needs information sharing. So I would like to ask your opinion, and then after that, I would like to open the floor to the public, to the audience. Maybe I think, Angela, you can start.
Yes, so one of the things, so I think that the slide highlights the diversity of approaches and diversity of models that ultimately will exist in the information sharing space. And I think that's a very good demonstration. The thing that I'd encourage people to look at behind this is that these are formal models first, and they're formal models that have been defined and built around achieving a particular outcome, and that the community who comes together and what they share is a function of the outcome they're looking to achieve. So the Digital Crime Center Consortium that has been highlighted and that has done the botnet takedown work, working with others in industry and working with governments around the world, is again very specifically focused. It doesn't say, I'm just focusing on cybercrime generally. It actually has a couple of core functions. The core functions include disrupting botnet operations, and then, for example, one of the other aspects is also protecting populations. There's work that's done through there on photo DNA that helps identify child exploitation. And so the thing there that I think is, again, that I just kind of wanted to pull out is that these are focused on outcomes. The FSISAC itself, very similarly, Microsoft is a participant in that as well, but was formed a long time ago, but became much more effective when the banking industry in the United States started to deal with a campaign against them of distributed denial of service attacks. It had always been a well-functioning organization, but it went into overdrive in effectiveness when they said, I'm not just working on sharing information, I'm now working about specifically responding to and disrupting a distributed denial of service attack against us. And then the one thing that I think isn't here that I would maybe add and then ask my colleagues to speak about is that there's also very organic formation of groups that happens that are not formalized. The models that are highlighted here are formalized models, but for those who have been around in this industry for a while, I think one of the things was the Conficker working group was formed very organically to deal with a very specific piece of malware that was out there in the ecosystem. And there are other examples of that as well. So because we're in a government and industry forum, I think we do have to think about structured models to information sharing and the outcome that they're focused on. I don't want us to forget that there's also organic formation of groups around specific problems.
Yeah, and can I just add to that? I mean, I think that's actually a really, really important point, and potentially a takeaway for everyone in this room, which is, yeah, right. I mean, you don't have to wait for this solution set to be solved for you. I think that this informal information sharing is very, very common. I think it's actually what the ISAO concept is based upon, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I can tell you that in New York City, for example, the largest banks in the world, they get together and they are sharing as much threat information as they can with one another. And there are models that are out that are being espoused right now about going to a place where there's truly machine to machine among that elite group of the biggest, the wealthiest banks in the world, and I think we will see similar kind of constructs occur in other industries and other sectors and geographies. But I do think that, for everyone in the room, one thing you can take away from this conference, hopefully, immediately is if you're not actively involved in information sharing today, you should be tomorrow. And you could do it maybe with people that you met here at this conference or other people that you may know. When I look at this information sharing summary matrix, I do agree that the informals are not represented, and I would say that this is, again, where the ISAO concept kicks in, is it really does allow, I think the way it will unfold is it allows formation, it could be across industry, it could be in geography, it could be for a temporary purpose, or it could be across a business process, business function. It can be any of those things. I think the idea is the ISAOs, again, can fill the gaps for those that haven't fallen into one of the ISACs or one of the other information mechanisms. And I believe it will, in fact, go regional, national, global. I think that is the intention of that architecture.
Yeah, and I just think the last thing that I would add is just to highlight Angela's point that these are all different organizations formed for different purposes, and that it's extremely useful to catalog what's out there because, again, continuing to proliferate centers that duplicate unnecessarily, can ultimately be destructive. The question about then chartering international, global, regional, national centers to do a particular thing is you have to have the stakeholders together to make that determination. Again, because it's just so important that the stakeholders and the governance, the members of essentially the governance process all agree that this is the purpose of the organization, this is the purpose of the process. And so the cataloging provides the foundation for those instances when you have that kind of mass of stakeholders from both public and private to be able to come together and say, yes, we believe that the charter of X or Y or Z should be to provide the integrating structure or to fill the regional gap or to provide the national input to an overall structure. But the cataloging is such an important piece of that process.
Can I just add two other very quick points, and they'll be quick. One of them is that there are technology standards that are out there today to enable threat information sharing. Styx Taxi, for example. I think we'll see more, perhaps development of more or richer mechanisms so we can really truly go to machine speed, but those exist today. And then the other point is, this is one that all of us talked about. I think we need to accentuate it before we open it up to the audience, and that is that we're talking a lot about information sharing. I think we all have said it's very, very important, but it is not in and of itself the panacea. It is not the solution. And I think we heard this in all of the sessions yesterday. It was emphasized, but let's not forget about the fundamentals. We actually have to focus quite a bit on cybersecurity, hygiene, patch management, identifying, understanding, being able to articulate your networking connections and the devices that are part of the network, inclusive of attack surface increase that comes from the use of the Internet of Things and other uses of technology.
I agree. So maybe I think that's now's the time to open the floor to the audience. Is there anyone who want to pose a question?
We were so comprehensive. Yeah.
Alexander.
Thank you. I think the exchange, the conversation this morning was much more comprehensive than what was actually discussed yesterday. So it was a bit more than summarizing what happened yesterday. One feeling I got from panels 2 and 3 is that there is still a complete disconnect between criminal justice and private industry here. This was a cybercrime track, but primarily the discussion was about protecting systems. It was not about bringing offenders to justice. And just as a footnote to this, most of the international requests for data through mutual legal assistance or police-to-police cooperation is actually not related to cybercrime. It's related to evidence on computer systems. Child exploitation issues, that's not a cybersecurity matter. It's nothing to do with protecting systems. It's about protecting children in this case and bringing offenders to justice. And there seems to be very little incentive from private sector in the prosecution side. The sort of things that Microsoft did, and I think we talked about it yesterday after the session, about botnet takedown combined with eventually then prosecutions is an exception. Yesterday, a number of the panelists in different sessions said, actually, governments stay out. You know, I think I felt very awkward for you. Yesterday, you were sitting in one panel where everybody said basically, governments stay out. And we with the private sector, we can handle that. That doesn't really encourage this sort of information sharing and so on. So there's a lot still to be done. And I'm the executive secretary of the Cybercrime Convention Committee. That's prosecutors, primarily prosecutors and investigators from 66 states, plus international organizations, Interpol is there, Europol, and others. It's a very, very different world from what was discussed here, unfortunately. I think we have to find a way to bridge those two worlds.
Thank you. Alan?
Well, I think that's an important point. And I think we did actually discuss that. We know we discussed that as we were talking about what we heard, which is that it's easy. As you pointed out, it's easy for industry to say, look, we have this handled. It's also easy for government or for law enforcement to say, this is solely about the prosecution of the crimes that we've been able to build a case about. But really, it can't be about only one or the other of that, because ultimately, there isn't enough law enforcement resources in the world to address the total surface area of cybercrime. Likewise, there isn't, private industry is not going to be able to create the deterrent effect that successful law enforcement investigations and prosecutions can, as well as just the physical act of removing cyber criminals from networks. But ultimately, it's important as we talk about solutions that we have to think comprehensively, and we must be cognizant of the criminal investigation and prosecution side of the cybercrime problem, but we also have to be cognizant of the front end of the problem, of prevention and deterrence and disruption, as well as just criminal investigation and prosecution.
I would just add, you're absolutely right. It is extremely hard. It's extremely hard for many reasons. It's extremely hard because there are thresholds that need to be crossed. It's extremely hard because we spent quite a bit of time talking about the fact that the volume, the number of cases and attacks thanks to technology, has exploded. So there's an overwhelming factor as well. And I think the point you made yesterday about there's really ineffective use of the Budapest Convention is also a real inhibitor to more prosecution. So I think the conversation shifts away from using that as the mechanism to deter or to reduce to, well, how do we just, if we can't follow that pathway, we've got to do something about it. And that's where the conversation switches to cybersecurity. And then we haven't even talked about, there's cybercrime, and I think that Kaspersky did a nice job of talking about, espionage. In an espionage world, you're talking about issues on a geopolitical stage that are, I think, in and of themselves extremely difficult to deal with. And yet, you made the point yesterday that all acts of espionage are in fact unlawful, and so that goes into this whole other geopolitical sphere that's very, very, I think, just very hard.
And maybe I'll just comment a little bit, as I think I'm an industry representative here. First of all, happy to hear that Microsoft is an exception. I think we operate at a scale and with a large history and recognize our role in helping to improve this. But when you start looking at the diversity of the private sector, not only in the IT and communications industry, but beyond, I think a lot of what I understand and hear from folks of the concern of government is more about government stifling innovation and stifling the ability to effectuate an outcome. And what does bring players who are not necessarily at the same place on the maturity cycle of having these strong interactions with government, and this is going to be more important as we go to the IoT world, is going to be things that are focused on results. Companies, regardless of size and scale, go, you know what? If we can actually reduce some risk, I'm happy to come to the table. But if it's going to be a conversation around, well, like, what are we trying to accomplish, and who are we going to talk about it with? I mean, it's a very results, the technical community in particular is very results oriented. And so I think the more that we can think about what are those specific outcomes, that's why I started to go down from cybercrime into child exploitation and how technology can help that, or botnet takedown and who can help with that. I think we have to break down the overall objective into consumable problem bites, and then people will come together around that and say, oh, we can effectuate change there, let's do it. So just something that I think these overall PPPs have to think about is potentially becoming more practicable about what can be achieved, making them more consumable bites, and then you'll start to, I think, have more incentive. When people see something accomplished, they're much more willing to come back to the table.
Well, I think that 5 minutes to go, but I think is there any other question? We need to stay on time, so I think that's on time. So far, it's okay. 5 minutes to go. Well, actually, no. I would say, actually, the information sharing platform that Alexander, you mentioned, I think it depends on the purpose of information sharing, once again, because I think that the activity like prevention, detection, disruption, investigation, and the prosecution of cybercrime, depending on at which level you are and you want to do, then the way of communication is different. So in terms of the prevention and the detection of the cybercrimes, we don't need to go through some sort of emulat process. No, I think we don't need to do so. I think that we can be more flexible to exchange information, but when it comes to the investigation, it's evidence level of exchange of information and the prosecution, because we need to put the evidence in front of the law, in front of the court. We need to go through formal process, that is emulat or the Budapest Convention based actual channel of information. So I think that's there are a variety of way of information sharing, but once again, the outcomes is very important, not just output. The outcomes are very important. I believe that as long as we understand each other's purpose of information sharing through certain mechanism, because I think that at the end of the day, future might be machine-to-machine automated information sharing mechanism by using AI, or actually artificial intelligence, that much faster than manual way of the information sharing. I don't know, but I think that you mentioned that technology is actually the force multiplier to facilitate the information sharing amongst the different stakeholders. I think that's actually perspective is also taken into consideration. David.
No, I mean, that's the goal. The goal is to get there, I think, and I think eventually we will get there. I think it's a question of when. I think there's a lot of investment right now that's flowing into developing technologies that can do this effectively. But I mean, Michael Daniel said that's something that, you know, the administration of the United States, they're very, very eager to get to a place where their society can benefit from more machine to machine. And I think that, you know, what's so interesting about that is, I mean, you know, machine to machine as well as information sharing itself. One of the byproducts of the advancement in this space will be it will increase the economic cost on the side of the threat actor. And I think that's, you know, this is a very, very important part of this equation. I think it's very inexpensive to undertake cyber attacks today. It makes it very, very economically attractive. And this is just one of the areas where the battle must be fought to make it hard and expensive to develop and utilize 0 days and other types of malware, which is why we need to work very hard together to make it harder and more costly to conduct cybercrime.
Before concluding, maybe one comment from
No,
you.
and I would actually echo the comment here, which is that is absolutely true in the general cybercrime discussion, or the general cybersecurity discussion. For achieving the outcomes of reducing cybercrime or addressing cybercrime, the question really is, how do these different structures, how does automated information sharing, how does bringing stakeholders to the table, how does that drive at the specific question of reducing cybercrime? How does that help us in that instance? And I think that just that making sure, as we do think about cybercrime specifically, we keep that question in mind.
One last
last
comment.
comment for me, time is up. I would guess I say we've talked a lot about government to industry collaboration. I would just highlight that there is a lot in the industry to industry collaboration that is going on. And one other piece that we did not talk about is needs for improvement in government to government collaboration, particularly on differing and inconsistent regulatory and legal frameworks, because that creates a huge amount of friction that both in deterring and prosecuting cybercrime as well as in other spaces. So a great opportunity for government to government collaboration. So just another closing
Thank you
thought.
so much. Thank you so much. I think that's the no more comments, right? No more comments.
Stop.
Okay, actually time is up. I hope that you enjoyed the entire session, and then I thank you also all the panelists. Thank you so much.